In the early years of the 20th century, Burnley was a town shaped by routine, by tram timetables, factory hours, and the quiet predictability of daily life. Yet on a warm Sunday evening in June, that routine would be broken by an act of violence that would echo far beyond the streets where it had occurred. This is the story of Amelia Wood. "28-year-old Amelia had, until the 15th of June 1912, been employed as a scullery maid at a cafe called BSK over in Burnley. Prior to early May, she had lodged with fellow servants from the same cafe, Mrs. Cooper, at Uby Street. She had lived a modest, largely unnoticed life, known chiefly to those she worked beside. But on the evening of Sunday, the 23rd of June, Amelia left home sometime between 6 and 6:30, and she never returned. That same afternoon, John Smith had left the house he had shared with his employer, butcher Thomas Ireland, on Brunswick Street in Nelson. Smith was 22 years old, the son of a labourer from Clitheroe. When he left the house between 1 and 2 o'clock, he was dressed in a blue serge suit and a hard felt hat. Later that same afternoon, Smith met up with an acquaintance by the name of Albert Hartley, and together the pair got on a tram and made their way over here to Burnley. They spent several hours drinking in and around the Burnley area itself in the many pubs. They were in a fresh and jolly mood. The pair remained in one pub in particular until around 6:15. Then they made their way into the centre of Burnley. And at 7 o'clock that evening, near the Bay Horse Hotel, Smith crossed the streets and headed towards a young woman standing on the opposite side. Now, that woman, it would later emerge, was Amelia Wood. And Smith spent several minutes, seemingly, in small talk with Amelia. And then the pair simply walked off together. Hartley went his way, and Smith and Amelia went the opposite way. At 8:40 p.m, a kitchen maid employed at the same cafe as Amelia saw her on Parliament Street walking with a young man in the direction of Todmorden Road. And this was the last confirmed sighting of Amelia Wood alive. Just before 6 o'clock the following morning, on Monday the 24th of June, a man named Hurd, a foreman carter employed by the Burnley Cooperative Society, arrived at the Society's laundry stables at Brunshaw on the outskirts of the town. In front of the harness room, he noticed a broken umbrella, its handle pulled out. Inside, a hat pin lay on the floor, and outside the cart shed itself, he saw a woman's crushed hat. What we will do, we will overlay some old OS maps, Ordnance Survey maps, over some of the narrative of this story to show you where the Cooperative Society laundry itself once stood. The area itself has now been redeveloped, as you will soon shortly see. So there is a lot of new build houses where that society used to be. We do have one old photo which shows a lot of people all sat down on benches outside the society. But this photo was taken, I think, sometime in the 1920s from recollection. But we'll put that over the top anyway. You will see parts of the old society behind those people, but not too much. There isn't too much to see. But it is still an important photograph because it does show the location of where this building, this property once stood. But like I said, a lot has changed over the years, and that society has long since gone. It's vanished, to be replaced by new build houses. So much has changed over the course of well over 100 years. And what we're looking at now, certainly, it would not have looked like this back then. And it is just maybe a couple of 100 yards in front of us where the cooperative laundry or the cooperative society laundry would have stood. There are new build houses there now. It is a residence now. A lot of people live in and around this area. And like I said, new build houses have taken over where that society once was. But it's most certainly here where Amelia and Smith made their way to back in 1912. Now, looking further, Heard would go on to make a grim discovery. It is just where those houses are and where the arrow is now being placed. It is there where the society once stood, and it is there where sadly the body of Amelia will be discovered in the early hours of Monday the 24th of June. Amelia Wood lay on her back on the floor of the shed. Some written reports later claimed that her clothing was raised to her knees, but this would be ruled out at the upcoming post-mortem. Her right arm was fully outstretched, her hand resting close to her dress. She was dead. Heard went immediately for assistance and telephoned the police. By 5:50 that morning, 2 police constables arrived at the scene, and they brought with them one of these old-fashioned ambulance carts. They discovered Amelia laying on the floor. She was wearing no gloves. Her clothes were somewhat in disarray, but not to the extent the newspaper articles had written. They found the hat pin, the hairpin, and they found an handkerchief close to the body. After a short time of obviously looking around the area itself for any further clues, Amelia's body was placed onto the cart and it was taken to the nearby mortuary. A post-mortem examination was conducted on Tuesday the 25th of June. Blood-stained froth issued from her mouth and nose. Her face and neck were badly bruised, her skin marked with dirt and dust. Bruises and scratches covered her body, with the most severe injuries concentrated around her neck. Now, the cause of death was determined to be asphyxia by strangulation. Now, as police began to investigate, obviously, this horrific crime, and obviously as the body lay cold in the mortuary, many witnesses soon began to come forwards, and many of them would detail the last known sightings of Amelia. But more interestingly, they would also give clear details and descriptions of the young man she had been seen with. At 9:50 p.m. on the night Amelia disappeared, 3 men near the cooperative laundry at Brunshaw saw a young man coming from the direction of the cart shed. Their descriptions would later identify him as being John Smith. As he approached, a dog lunged towards him before being pulled back by its owner. Smith passed the group and said simply "good night" and went through a gate. Now, 25 minutes later, a small group that had gathered at the end of Cross Street were approached by a young man hurrying towards them. "Can you direct me to the station or tram?" he asked. "I am a stranger here." He appeared anxious and eager to leave. After being directed toward the town centre, he repeatedly thanked the group and moved away. So it was here on St James Street where Amelia would have been standing, somewhere roughly directly in front of us. And where we're currently stood is where Smith and his friend Hartley would have been walking along. Now, from all accounts, Smith noticed Amelia stood on her own, like I said, directly in front, and he made his way over to her, and it is there where he purposely bumped into her. He apologised, and Amelia replied, saying it's all good, basically nothing to worry about. And from there on, they spent several minutes talking before making their way along in this direction and to where they would eventually end up at those cooperative society buildings in Brunshaw. Smith would spend the next few days alone with his thoughts over in Nelson, and from all accounts he carried on living life in a normal sort of way. But the immense pressure of guilt was beginning to slowly eat away at him. And at the beginning of July that year, with the pressure building up, with guilt and remorse finally beginning to chip away at his exterior, Smith made the relatively short journey over to Blackpool.
Mooning and spooning was Flo's delight, so to her sweetheart she said one night, I wish you'd take me the picture to see at the bioscope, Joe, but he said I fail to see where the fun comes in, dear.
It was on Monday, the 1st of July, when Smith made that trip to Blackpool, but his stay at the popular tourist destination would quickly come to an end. The following afternoon, near Central Station, Smith approached a woman named Mrs. Whip. A police constable stood nearby. Now, placing his hand on Mrs. Whip's shoulder, Smith said quietly, "Tell that Bobby I want locking up." Now, when asked why, he replied, "I murdered a young woman at Burnley 2 Sundays ago. Her name was Wood." Mrs. Whip then urged Smith to speak to the officer himself. Smith told her he had been walking up and down the area, hoping the police would arrest him. He said he could neither sleep nor eat, and he wanted it to end. A few moments passed between Smith and Mrs. Whip, and Smith eventually built up the courage to go and speak to the police constable himself. And he went over to the constable and he simply said, "I want locking up because I murdered a woman over in Burnley. Amelia Wood, whom I strangled at Burnley in a cart shed 2 Sundays ago," Smith would go on to say. Slightly startled by this extremely odd confession, the police constable, unsure at this point if Smith was being serious or not, took Smith to the police station. And it was whilst in custody Smith broke down completely and he confessed in detail. Now Smith, full of remorse and guilt at this point, he broke down and, like I said, he confessed. He told the detectives and the police constables of what transpired and how he had seen Amelia stood just outside one of the public houses along St James's Street. He also told the authorities of how he made his way over from one side of the road to make his way over to where Amelia was standing, and he purposely bumped into her. He apologised, and Amelia herself said, "Don't worry about it, everything's fine." They got into some small talk, and Amelia then told Smith that she had been waiting for a young boyfriend, basically, a young man. And this young man simply hadn't turned up. So Smith turned round to Amelia and he said, "Well, perhaps I may do." To which Amelia replied in some context that, "Yeah, perhaps you will." The young couple then made their way along St James's Street and towards Brunshaw, and obviously where the attack on Amelia would later take place. Smith's written statement outlined every step they had taken, every narrow street and alley they passed through until they arrived at the cart shed. Smith was then transferred to the Blackburn police station where the Chief Constable of Burnley spoke to him. "Do you know the seriousness of your statement?" he asked, to which Smith replied, "Yes. I know I cannot stand it any longer. I can't sleep or eat anything. It's quite true. Now, when formally charged with the willful murder, Smith made no reply. Later, he asked to see his brother, saying he did not want to think he had killed Amelia on purpose. Back here at Burnley Cemetery, and I've mentioned this numerous times in our videos, but we do often struggle to find the final resting places of those people whose stories we are retelling, simply because the headstones are no longer visible. We've just spent the best part of 45 minutes, perhaps even longer, looking at every single headstone that is available to us in this plot. And we are looking for A9536, which is the final resting place or the burial plot of Amelia Woods. And as you can see from where we are, there are a lot of headstones missing, but we do believe she is somewhere in this location. We've made our way up and down the rows where all these headstones are, but there are a lot missing in this area, and the area in question as to where Amelia is somewhere interred. And it's just sad again that obviously an innocent life that was taken so abruptly just over 100 years ago, and it is so difficult to pinpoint the exact location as to where she's buried and where we can leave obviously our purple rose. And I do have our purple rose to hand, just in case obviously we could have located that final resting place. But I think today that simply isn't going to happen. One of the things I found quite shocking and alarming when researching this story is that the young man Hartley, who had spent time with John Smith on the evening, obviously, of Amelia's murder, he never came forward until, obviously, the arrest of John Smith himself, or I should say until John Smith handed himself in, and then obviously all hell broke loose. The newspapers at the time, from the day of Amelia's discovery, the discovery of the body, I should say, the newspapers, the local newspapers at that, they were full of this sensational story. And I say sensational because at the time it was. And some of the descriptions of the body of the young lady, Amelia, they were quite descriptive. And yet Hartley, the man who Smith had spent time with in and around Burnley and the public houses, he never came forward until Smith had been, well, after he'd been charged basically with the murder of Amelia. Why is that? Perhaps Hartley himself didn't realise Smith had been arrested at this point. Perhaps he knew Smith had been arrested and he didn't want to be implicated in the death of Amelia. Perhaps he was just too scared to go to the police and give them any information about what had happened on that evening when Smith and Hartley had been in and around Burnley. We will never know. But there are certainly no records in any of the local newspapers which indicate that Hartley himself went to the police the day or the days after the discovery of Amelia's body, despite, like I said, the newspapers being full of this sensational story. 2 hearings were held on the 3rd and 6th of July. Smith was remanded twice by the Burnley magistrates. But on Friday the 26th of July, following a 3rd hearing, Smith was finally committed for trial at the Manchester Assizes, and that trial opened on Tuesday the 3rd of December 1912. Now, to the question of who had murdered Amelia Wood, the answer was quite simple. It was John Smith. The court heard Smith's confession read aloud, and it went as follows. I did not know her. We went for a walk together and went into a cart shed. Something came over me and I lost control over myself. I took hold of her by the throat and could not let go. Although I tried many a time, I stopped with her about a quarter of an hour after she had died. Smith went into great detail as to the conversation that he had with Amelia after bumping into her and after apologising. And Amelia had said to him that, as we have touched upon, she had been waiting for a young man to arrive, which he failed to do so. And after Smith had kind of talked her into walking along with him instead of waiting for a young man, Amelia obligingly did so. Now, perhaps she may have been a little bit flirtatious. Perhaps Smith himself was just a little too charming. We will never know why Amelia decided to walk along with a man who she never knew. As the two walked on together, Amelia suggested they go for a quiet drink, but Smith later said he declined, explaining that he had already consumed 2 drinks and feared any more would leave him intoxicated. And as they passed a number of buildings, Amelia led Smith into a narrow lane. When he asked whether the lane led onto a road, she replied that she did not know. They passed a house where someone sat at a window before continuing on towards other buildings. Eventually they entered a cart shed at the top of a path. Inside stood a lorry covered over. Amelia placed her umbrella and coat upon it, and the pair moved towards the rear of the shed, Smith's arms around her. They kissed, and shortly afterwards Amelia removed her hat, placing it beside an upturned cart. She then asked Smith to tie the lace of her boot, which had come loose, and he did so. According to Smith's account, once he had finished, he put his arms around her neck and drew her towards him. Amelia appeared to sag in his arms, as though she was fainting. He spoke to her, but she did not respond, and he lowered her gently to the ground. Smith went on to say that he knelt beside her and attempted to revive her, rubbing her arms and legs. He felt for her heart, but could detect no movements, and he remained with her for a short time before leaving the shed. Now, when Smith was questioned about the marks that had been found on the throat and neck of Amelia, he said that he had been tickling her, and he had one of his arms wrapped tightly around her neck, but not with enough force to have strangled her. It seems highly plausible that some of what Smith was talking about was indeed true. Maybe from the part of meeting Amelia for going for a drink, which they didn't do, in which Amelia obviously asked Smith if that's what he wanted to do, and then obviously making their way through the narrow buildings, the narrow alleyways, and into the cart shed. Perhaps all that bit is true. But what I find personally difficult to believe is his account of what actually occurred in the cart shed. Yes, they probably did kiss, but as for putting one arm around Amelia's neck and throat to the point where she simply fainted, I find highly dubious. However, what I may find dubious is completely irrelevant, because at the end of the day, it seemed that the jury were convinced by not just his statement, but by also the final remarks by his solicitor, by the barrister who was defending him. He put forward an extremely plausible case. The marks on Amelia's neck were finger marks. They weren't marks caused by somebody's arm, like the pressure of clothing or an arm. They were finger marks. But yet the jury seemed to believe Smith's account of what occurred. It was under cross-examination that Smith repeated that the bruising had been caused in this manner, insisting there had been no intention to harm her. Now, Mr. Wingate Saul, defending, told the jury that Smith could not be convicted of willful murder because the evidence simply did not point to murder, and that the story Smith had told was very much plausible, and there was no evidence that anything of what had occurred was premeditated. Saul also spoke of how Smith had spent 9 days of sleeplessness, worry, and a lack of food. Guilt had been eating away at him with each day that had passed, and that he was in no condition to know the difference between what constituted murder, manslaughter, or death by accident. The jury would retire at around 4:30 p.m. that same afternoon, and they were only away for a few minutes to deliberate the actual verdict. And when they came back into the courts, the Manchester courts, they gave a verdict of murder, willful murder at that. But they asked and they recommended mercy for the sentence in the hope that Smith would not be hanged. However, Lord Coleridge described the killing as a crime of elemental savagery. And as was customary, the sentence of death by hanging was indeed passed. The execution was fixed for Tuesday, the 24th of December, 1912. A petition was quickly arranged, and over the coming days, many people signed this petition. And in total, 67,336 people would sign it, all asking and pleading the Home Secretary for mercy. The petition itself would cite youth, previous good character, and the jury's recommendation. And on Saturday, the 21st of December, John Smith was walking in his cell at Strangeways Prison and informed that the petitioning had been successful and that his sentence had been commuted. He would not hang. Now, instead of his execution taking place, John Smith would serve life imprisonment, serving penal servitude. And we do have a record of his criminal conviction, which does clearly show that the hanging itself had been overturned, and indeed Smith would serve penal servitude. For John Smith, the law showed mercy, but for Amelia Wood there was none. Her life ended alone in a cart shed on the outskirts of Burnley, her final moments known only through the words of the man who killed her. In courts, much was said about guilt, remorse, and the workings of a troubled mind, but far less about the quiet young woman who had left her home one summer evening and never came back. Amelia had been waiting for a young man that evening, but he never arrived. It was then that Smith approached her on St James Street. From that moment they walked together through the narrow, dimly lit streets of Burnley, streets that twisted and turned, hiding the city's shadows and secrets. Some may suggest that Amelia herself may have been flirtatious, playful even, a young woman unafraid of a little attention. In the social customs of their time, such behaviour would have been seen as light-hearted rather than reckless. Perhaps she found Smith charming, or perhaps she simply enjoyed the fleeting company of someone who seemed interested in her. Why would she follow a man she barely knew into such seclusion may never be fully understood. Perhaps she trusted him, swayed by charm or social politeness, or perhaps Smith's account was carefully shaped after the fact, presenting her as willing to mask the violence he would soon commit. After all, they arrived at a lonely cart shed, removed from the watchful eyes of the street. It was here, in the shadowed corner of Burnley, that the night took a tragic turn. And though Smith would later recount the events in chilling detail, the truth of Amelia's choices and the danger she faced remains locked in that fateful evening, forever etched into the town's memory. Amelia Wood became another name in the records, another victim of an era that offered little protection and no second chances. And more than a century later, her story remains silent and unsettling.